All right, I just finished building a ton of acoustic panels, and I just want to walk through exactly how I did it step by step using mostly supplies that you can get at Lowe's or Home Depot. Building these panels is a 5-step process, and step number 1 is framing. And we are going to be using 1x4 boards for this build because they're 3.5 inches deep, which is deep enough to be effective acoustic treatment, broadband acoustic panels, and they're 3/4 inch thick. That doesn't matter except that you need to factor it in when you're planning your dimensions for your build. Now, for dimensions, you can make them very specific to your space, but it's going to be easiest if you actually kind of follow along with some of the dimensions of things that are going in the panel, specifically with the actual insulation that's going into it. So the insulation in your panels comes in 47-inch segments. That's 15.25 inch wide. This is Rockwell insulation. You just grab it from Lowe's or Home Depot. And that allows you to build a 32-inch wide panel by a roughly 4 feet tall panel. That's great. The ones I'm building here are actually 6 feet because I'm recording drums, and your kick drum and snare are pretty low to the ground. So I need these to span basically the majority of the wall. But if you're just recording vocals, acoustic guitar, things like that, then just a 4-foot panel is perfect. And one package of Rockwell insulation could build you 6 32-inch wide panels that are 4 feet tall, which is plenty for most home studios. Now, I'll list the dimensions you want for your cuts if you want to build a panel like that down in the description below. But you want 47 inches for your sides, you want 32 inches for your top and bottom, and then for the bracers that are in between, you want those to be 30.5 inches. Okay, let's go and jump into the framing. The first thing we need to do for our framing is to cut our boards. Now, if you go to a Lowe's or Home Depot, there's a good chance they might be able to cut the boards for you. So definitely have your measurements prepared when you get there. And if they can, they will cut them for you. Take advantage of that, especially if you're not comfortable with the saw or you don't own a saw. And if they can't cut it for you, maybe go back at a different time if you're someone who's really not comfortable with cutting. But if you have a saw and you want to cut, let me give you a couple tips that I've found that have helped me a lot. And keep in mind, I am not a craftsman in this way. I just am someone who's done a handful of projects. So if I can do it, you can definitely do it as well. So tip 1 is that you want to cut your left and right and your top and bottom boards at the same time so that those measurements are exactly the same, so that you are going to have a nice square or rectangular panel. That's going to save you a bunch of headache. So what I do is I clamp my boards together. I just make sure that one end, the end that I'm measuring from, is lined up perfectly, and then I clamp my boards together. And that allows me to know that these boards are going to be the exact same length when I'm done cutting. If you don't have clamps, I would probably just do 2 cuts and just make sure that you're really, really precise in your measuring. So with your measuring, you'll need a measuring tape. We're just going to measure from the side that we've clamped down if you are clamping your boards together. And then you'll also need a speed square. These are like a couple of bucks. Definitely pick one up. They make it much easier to get these measurements quickly and accurately. You're just going to slide that behind your speed square here. Pull that to the right place. Slide your board down. And just set your speed square just past the point, like just behind the point, so that as you draw your line, it lines up right on the measurement. And then I always check without the speed square there, just flattening. That way, if I'm slightly off, I know which direction I'm slightly off. So in this case, I'm slightly to the right. Now, you want to measure twice, cut once. So we've already measured twice, but I like to even do kind of a third little measurement, which is that I just run my blade right along the line here. You can definitely do this with just a circular saw. If you don't have a saw at all and you think you're going to do projects in the future, you're going to build a ton of panels, I would grab this miter saw from Craftsman. It's battery powered. Speaking of which, I got to put the battery in it. And this just means I can use it anywhere, anytime. I don't have to run a cable to it or anything like that. So line up your blade. Make sure that it's going to cut exactly where you want it to. And just move your board slightly if you need to, until your cut is going to be exactly the cut that you want it to be. And then protect your eyes. Look real cool with these glasses on. And there we go. Super clean cut. I'm going to go ahead and cut the rest of the boards for this panel and talk to you in a second. Now, real quick, the reason that you want to measure from the side that you're cutting from is because even though these are 8 feet or whatever length you get coming from Lowe's or Home Depot, you're going to have a variation in the boards. Do you see that? So you got to make sure that you measure from the same side, that you're not measuring the difference from that length, because it might be adding a 1/4 inch or something like that to your boards. I made that mistake when I was doing all these boards behind me, messed up a bunch of my cuts. I had to get new wood, all that stuff. It was a real pain. So be sure to pay attention which side you're measuring from. Don't measure the difference from the shorter side or anything like that. It's going to throw you off. So once your boards are cut, you want to lay them out, and you want the bottom and the top to be on the bottom and the top, as in you want to butt the sides down into the bottom and the top. Now, I definitely recommend, if you have a buddy to help you hold this, do that. In this case, I'm building these solos, so I'm going to use these cool little corner clamps. We have these from years ago when my brother used to build frames for his artwork. But I'll link down below to an Amazon link of something that's similar. But you just want to use these to line these boards up and lock them in really tight, so that you'll have super square lined up boards, and your overall rectangular shape will be very squared. And so you just pop these on and then pull down. And what I found works the best is to line up just the entire top first and then the entire bottom. And you just line it up so that the top is tight here, and then you tighten this one, or the side is tight up against the bottom, and then you tighten this one, and then you just get the side lined up where that corner is really clean and square. And I just do this by feeling, because the clamp will make it square for me. And I just tighten it right there, and make sure that it's also square going this way on like the face or the back of the panel. So in this case, I did it where it's a little bit too high, so I'm gonna lift that up. And that feels better to me. There we go. And then same thing down here on the bottom. And then we can go ahead and start drilling and screwing. Now, again, if you have a buddy who can hold it for you, then go that route. But if you don't, then these clamps are super helpful. And just 2 is enough, because you're just gonna do 1 corner at a time anyway. Okay, now for screws, I recommend these GRK fasteners. These are cabinet screws. So they have this little integrated washer at the top, which I think just gives a little bit more stability. And these are number 8, 1.5 inch screws, which is good for this 1x4 board. And then because it's a number 8 screw, you want to make sure you pre-drill that size. So number 8, just look that up on Google, but in this case, it's a 7x64. If you end up with a different number screw, just make sure you get the right size drill bit. We're just going to do 2 holes. Make sure you're lined up in your sideboard, and then we're just going to do a hole right in the middle of that board. And then right in the middle of the board on the other side. Boom. And then the cool thing with these GRK screws is it has this special star bit that is way easier. It doesn't pop out as much as Phillips heads, which is just nicer and easier to work with. And we're going to screw that in. And get it nice and tight. You don't have to, I over-tighten that one just a little bit. You don't have to do that. But get it nice and tight so that you know it's going to hold. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so once all 4 corners are done, it's time to do the center bracer. And this is really important, even in a smallish panel, because you're going to pull the fabric very tight, and you don't want to pull the boards in the middle. And it's pretty easy without this bracer to just bend these boards. So if I'm pulling fabric really tight against them, I'm going to bend those boards. And so you want at least a center brace. In this case, because this is a 6-foot panel that I'm building, I'm going to do a top and bottom as well. But even with the one I'm recommending, basically 4 feet by 32 inches, so almost 4 by 3 feet, I would do a top, middle, and bottom as well, just for the sake of a little extra structural integrity. And these boards don't weigh a lot, so they're not adding a ton of weight to the panel, and it will make it more substantial at the point where you're hanging it from in the future. So to do this for the middle one, all we're doing is just measuring from one side, finding the center point of our panel here, which for me is about 3 feet. So I'll go 3 feet. This does not have to be super exact. And then the middle point of your board, which these are 1x4s. 1x4 board is actually 3.5 inches. So I'm going to go 1 3/4 inches. And then I'm just going to eyeball line this up, because again, it doesn't matter a ton. And we're just going to hold it with one hand and drill into one side. And then I'm going to go ahead and, since I'm just holding it by hand, put my screw in on that side. And I'm just using my thumb here to make sure that it's really flush against the back. And then we're going to do the same thing for the second side here, the other end of the other end of this board. So just 2 screws per board is plenty. And just make sure that you're lined up really well and go slowly so you don't accidentally drill into your finger. Don't ask me how I know that. I actually didn't do it with the drill, but I did do it with a nail gun at one point. But barely missed. It was okay. Awesome. And then just tighten them so they're nice and tight, and I'm going to go around and do that for all 3 bracers. One more thing with the bracers for your bottom and top bracers, if you're doing those, be sure you get a screw in the middle here. So just measure to the middle, mark that, throw your drill in, and then screw that bad boy in. And then at that point, if you hang the panel from this, or if you stand the panel up on the ground, you're going to have a lot of structural integrity because you're attached now on both sides over here and in the middle, and this is now super sturdy. Okay, so now that our framing is done, our panel is constructed, it is time for fabric part 1. We need to do the backing fabric before we put the insulation in, and we'll actually do 1/2 of the front fabric before we put the insulation in as well. We'll talk about that in just a second. So first up, the backing fabric. What I have discovered to be the cheapest way to get this backing fabric, which doesn't need to be anything fancy, it just needs to hold the insulation in, is just a flat sheet. Just a cheap flat sheet. And you can do any color you want. I'll link to the ones that I got down on Amazon down below in the description. And yeah, they're just cheap flat sheets. And it was cheaper than getting fabric by the yard, at least as far as I could find it. So very good, affordable option here. And we're just going to line up, and huge tip, get an electric staple gun. These things, you have to do so many staples when you're building these panels, and the staple gun was not super expensive and is saving my hand so much because I don't know, a couple hundred staples probably in this one panel. You can do that times however many panels you do. So this is just the Bauer. I got it at Harbor Freight, I believe, and it works great. Also be sure that you get a bunch of staples because you're going to run out of staples a ton. So get a bunch of staples, way more than you think you're going to need. And we're just going to line up our fabric on here and start going for it. So you want it to be nice and tight, so you'll pull with your non-dominant hand as you staple with your dominant hand. And the way I like to do this is to line up just this whole first edge with the clean edge of the sheet. And this doesn't have to be stapled in a ton. We're going to want to staple the front fabric in a bunch because basically how many staples you do and how close you put them together will equate to how tight and clean your panels are going to stay looking, not saggy looking, if you will. You don't want that fabric to stretch out between staples. But on the back here, we don't have to do as many. So I'm still doing a bunch here. We don't have to do quite as many. So I like to go all the way down just the edge of the back with this, using the clean, straight line from the flat sheet. It's nice to have a clean edge for me to work with. And then once I get it all the way to the edge here, I like to come back on just barely on the inside of the panel, which is where we're going to be stapling our front fabric a little bit more. So I like to go ahead and do that in the back as well, so it's holding the insulation in place in line with where our fabric is pretty well. So we'll go ahead and do all this. We're almost done here. And then I'll come in on the inside, and we're just going to staple. And I like to change my grip here to something like this. And I usually just do these staples roughly in line with where I did the other staples. So this is just to get it in line with how we're going to be stapling the finished fabric when we get to that step in just a minute for the front. Couple along here, boom, boom. And you'll hear that it makes a sound as it gears up. Hopefully you could hear that. That's a good safety feature. Now, a pro tip when working with these, even though it's doing the stapling for you, you need to make sure you have enough pressure against it. Otherwise, it's going to kind of half staple it in, and that's no good. So go ahead and get this all the way through. And this will make sense why we're doing this here in just a minute, as I said, when we do the finishing fabric for the front side. You'll be like, ah, that makes sense. Now I see it. So for now, just trust me. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and finish this fabric for the backing, and I'll come back in when we start doing the fabric for the first half of the front before we flip this over to put the insulation into it. Okay, now that we are done putting the back fabric on, before we do the front fabric, we first need to cut the excess here. And this is gonna be a rough edge. I'll be honest with you. Maybe if you're really good at this stuff, it doesn't have to be. I'm not necessarily great with fabric. This is my first ever project with fabric, so, well, this and building the walls that we'll talk about in an upcoming video. But fabric is definitely not my forte. It's okay if this edge is rough because it's gonna be hidden. That's one of the beautiful things about these panels and the acoustic walls is that any of these rough edges, they're just hidden. So it doesn't matter. It's totally fine that you're gonna have some rough edges. But you just wanna cut off the excess here and leave as little slack as you can. Just get as close to the staples as you can. And just make sure that you don't poke a hole into the back. That'd be a real bummer, because then you'd have to redo it. So just take your time, cut off the excess. So ugly, but effective. So now that that's done, we will toss this off to the side and we're going to measure out our fabric that's going to be on the front of the panel. Now, the fabric that I went with for these panels is basically just a burlap. It's from ATS Acoustics, which is, I think, a good option for wholesale supplies at least. And this is their like own burlap. They call it acoustic fabric. It's basically a burlap, and it's not the most perfect fabric in the world, but that gives it kind of this nice natural feel, and it is wide enough in spacing that it's really good for acoustic transparency. That kind of stuff doesn't matter nearly as much as people say. As long as you're not using like vinyl or something super, super thick and rigid, then you'll be fine, because sound is going to pass through it. But in general, they say that you want it to be breathable so that the sound can transfer or travel through the fabric into your panel and not reflect off it. So this fabric is totally fine, definitely usable, and I think looks pretty nice and pretty earthy, organic, if you will. And it's given a cool feel to the space in the places that I've put it up. I can't remember the color. I'll list that down below in the description. So you just want to pull it past the top of your panel here. Make sure that you have plenty to get all the way around with some slack so you can pull it easily. And then you just want to roll it down to the bottom of the panel. And then we're going to use the roll that it came on as kind of our guide as we're cutting it to make sure that we're doing a fairly straight cut. Now I'm going to actually come over on this side to cut it because I am right-handed. And we're just going to cut along here. And again, it's okay if this isn't straight as long as you're definitely leaving yourself enough slack. You don't want to cut into it, an uneven line that cuts into it in a way that doesn't leave you enough slack. So make sure you have enough slack. As you're ordering it, make sure you order a little bit extra. If you need 1.5 yards, make sure you just go ahead and get 2 yards. And then that will give you the extra leeway wherever you need it to be sure that you're not running out of fabric and having really weird visible edges. Okay, so now that we have our fabric, we're just going to pull it so that we have it at the edge, and we're actually just going to staple this into place. That way we can put the insulation in and then pull the fabric over from one side. It will already be attached on this side, and when we flip it over, we can use that fabric to hold the insulation in. If you see people build with like Owens Corning 703 or an insulation like that, those insulations are a lot more rigid, so they basically can have you just sit the panel down on top of them. But because we're using the rock wool here, it's a little bit fluffier, it's a little bit softer, so we're not going to be able to just stick a panel over top, especially this nice structurally sound frame that we created. Okay, so just make sure you have enough slack on the end here. Make sure you're lined up, and I like to make sure that I'm a decent amount past on the end so that I can get all the way around and then have enough to pull it tight from top to bottom. So we're just making sure there's plenty of slack here. And then I want to come in close to this edge right here. And I'm going to start in this corner. Again, just using the edge, the pre-cut edge of this fabric as a general guide. We're going to grab our staple gun here, make sure it's on. And staple away. And here is where we're doing this right on the inside of this inset here. And I'm going to pull it nice and tight as I'm doing it. I'm going to flip my grip on the gun so I have a better grip here. Now with these, I'm actually doing 2 wide spacing already. You see how I have 1.5 inches-ish right there, maybe even 2 inches? That is enough that it's going to pucker, that it's going to look a little bit shabby from the front. So I actually want to go ahead and add an extra staple in all those places where I gave myself those 2 inches. You really want to have this nice and tight with plenty of staples that are really keeping it where it's going to stay clean and professional looking from the front. And if you don't have enough staples in, it basically will just pucker and look less than professional. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and finish this up. Okay, and once you finish the staples, we're just going to flip the panel over here. So lift the panel up. We're going to let the fabric kind of drag on the front here. We're going to get it lined up on our table, and then we're just going to pull this fabric back so that we can go ahead and get our insulation, which is the next step of the build. So for insulation, we are using rock wool Safe and Sound. This stuff is great. You want to be sure you're wearing gloves when you're handling it and you put on long sleeves. So I just threw on a very fluffy jacket for this. Definitely too hot for this jacket, but that's okay. Then you also want to be sure that you have a mask on once you start handling it. This stuff, you know, it can just irritate you. It's not necessarily the best to be breathing in. The fabric will keep it insulated enough. You're not going to get particles coming through that fabric. So you'll be fine in that regard. But yeah, you just want to take it and you want to slide it in. I have planned out this panel to be exactly 1.5 lengths and 2 wide. So it's great because I can just take 2 here, slide them in, and they are a perfect fit side by side. Slide that on in. Just make sure it's all lined up the way you want it to be. And then we're going to just cut a third one in half. So I can take this and I just need to measure, and it's 47 inches. But you want to measure because, especially if it hasn't fully expanded, it might be slightly under. And you want to just make sure that you actually cut it in half. So this is more like 46 and 3/4 right now. So I'm going to go just under 23.5. And the best blade, I tried a few different blades for all my different acoustic projects working with this insulation, is just a serrated blade. So this is just a Cuisinart knife, just a kitchen knife. And this has been absolutely hands down the best blade. This stuff is not super fun to cut. So we're going just under 23.5 for me. And I just use this, make a couple points here. Kind of marking. And then I'll come back and do a nice cleaner cut all the way, okay? So once you've got that marked, you can kind of just score it all the way. And what I found is it works better as opposed to cutting up or cutting back, is you actually cut forward into it. And that will give you less tearing and separation of it and give you just a cleaner edge. So if you do this right, you might not have to cut these at all. If you do basically the 47 by 32 inch panel or 48 by 32 inch panel, that's going to have 2 of these side by side. You don't have to cut any insulation. That would be my preference. In my case, because of these specific panels that I need to make for my studio, for my purposes, I want and need for them to be 40 or 6 feet tall. So I need it to basically be double the height, or 1.5 the height. So this works for me. And that's it. Now you have insulation in your panel and it's time to close it up with the fabric. Now, real quick, if you're watching this, I'm guessing you're building a home studio or working on improving your home studio, and I want to give you something to help with that. I put together a completely free Home Studio Pro checklist that walks through 4 steps to creating a professional home studio that makes making professional sounding music easy. It's completely free from the link in the description below. It's got a bunch of important information on acoustic treatment and how to design your studio to be optimal to you. Be sure to grab it, but let's go and jump back into the build. Okay, so now we just need to pull the fabric back over so that we can flip the panel over, and this fabric will hold the insulation in, and then we will pull it tight around it and staple back into the back on the other side, and then trim up and do our corners, and we'll be done. The corners are a whole thing in and of themselves, so we'll go through that really specifically here in just a second. Let's go ahead and flip this over. So you just want to grab it, make sure you have a little bit of tension on the fabric as you flip the panel over. This is obviously going to be a little bit easier if you have someone do this with you, but you totally can do this by yourself, especially with a smaller panel. And we were just laying it down. A little bit of a boom, as I would say to my 2-year-old daughter. Boom, no problem. Awesome. Okay, so then from there, all we have to do is staple the fabric the same way we did before. You just want to make sure you get it really, really tight, and I can't stress that enough. As tight as you can pull it. Don't rip it, but as tight as you can pull it. Staple down the same way we did on this side, and then I'll come back and we'll show you the corners. Okay, just want to highlight something as I'm wrapping this up. Notice how as I pull this, as I push down, even though I've pulled this as taut as I can, as I push down to put the staple in, it gets it a little bit tauter. So in addition to helping just really get that insulation sealed in well at these edges, it also is giving us just a little extra tension just by the basic mechanics of this. So as I pull and push, by doing it on this inside edge as opposed to on the top, it's just giving us a little bit more tension than we could easily get just with pulling. Hopefully that's clear in the video. Quick tip if you're working with a light color like this, because the insulation we're putting in this fabric is dark, with the burlap you can kind of see that dark color through the little grooves in the fabric. Whereas if you wrap your entire panel in the white sheet, so completely wrap it in the white sheet that we put on the backing, that will give you basically a white background to this burlap, which will just lighten the overall color. So if you really want a light tone, then consider wrapping the whole thing in that white sheet. And it's a subtle difference, but it is a difference. Okay, let's do a corner together. This is tricky, and I want to take my time with this and really explain it because there's not a lot of good videos on it, and I had to watch a lot to try to figure out what they were doing. So when you're doing the corners, you want to do one corner and then staple across to about halfway, maybe a little over halfway, and then do the second corner and kind of pull it back towards, that way you're kind of pulling everything just in and up just a little bit. Okay, so with the corners, the idea here is that we are going to pull down so it's getting tight along the side, and then create basically a seam, a little fold over right at this line right here, right at the bottom of the panel. That's a nice straight edge, and then we're going to pull that up, and it basically looks like a nice little folded over, I don't know, pastry package, I don't know. But to do it where it looks really clean, we need to trim any excess. So if you haven't already trimmed any excess you have up here, you don't want a ton of excess at the top because that's going to make it hard to handle. But you also want to trim any excess here. So the way that I do that is I figure out roughly where the bottom of the panel is, and I cut about an inch up from the bottom and then to about an inch from the edge here. So we're going to go ahead and do that here. And this doesn't have to be exact because this is all going to be hidden in the fold, but you don't want to overdo it. So especially with the first couple, it's a little bit better to cut a little bit too little and then just take a little bit more if you need to, or just have it be a slightly bulkier corner than to overcut and create a problem for yourself. You don't want to create problems for yourself. So something like this. And then what I like to do is pull it down here and then very close to the edge, get one staple in, kind of in the middle, but very close to the edge. So something like this, you can see it's a little awkward to work, but also try to show it here. So something like that. And then we will pull here, pull down, wall folding in and kind of creating this crease cinch here. And we are going to pull in as we pull up. And we're going to create this nice little, as I said, kind of like a pastry, a package, I don't know, corner here. And so we'll pull it up nice and taut. I like to fold over on this edge as well, just so it's clean, a clean edge right in this corner. And that'll give us something like this. Just make sure you're not protruding past this edge here. So something like that looks good to me. Go ahead and use a staple gun. Make sure you have your staple gun handy so that if you get it lined up right, you can just pop a staple in there. And then you're just going to pull up from the edge and work back towards the middle. And then sometimes you'll have like a slight puckering here, but as long as it's clean along here, that doesn't matter because again, all this is going to be hidden. Okay, so once you're done with your fabric, you're going to have something like this, an acoustic panel. Hey, you did it. We're done. Except that now it's time to hang it. So to hang it, we're going to use something called a French cleat. I think I've seen these called Z-clips too. I think they're the same thing. Either way, the way they work is you have two pieces. One piece that mounts to the wall that juts out at the top and one that mounts to the back of your panel that juts out at the bottom. And then you just slide the panel down into it, and it's super slim and sturdy, and it's pretty flush against the wall, so it's going to give you a nice clean look. But it's also very sturdy because these Z-clips have at least 2 screws in them. So even if you have to just do 2 drywall anchors, at least you have 2 drywall anchors and not just one. And ideally, you'll be able to get one of these into the stud. Now, we're going to be using 2 of these, so I'm definitely going to make sure I get into a stud. But if you're doing a smaller panel, you could do this just by center mounting your Z-clip on your panel and just doing one where you find the right place on the wall. You can just center mount it from that point on the panel. In our case, we're going to do 2, and that's largely because this panel is over about 6 feet tall, so it's a bigger, heavier panel. It's still not super heavy, but I just want to be extra careful with it. So let's go ahead and walk through the measuring and mounting process. Okay, the first thing we're going to measure is from the ceiling to the top of our panels. Now, in most cases, you want your panels to be at about 6.5 feet. If you have 4-foot panels, then that's going to cover you from about 2.5 feet all the way up to about 6.5 feet. That's going to give you pretty good coverage if you're sitting and playing acoustic guitar. It's going to capture those reflections. If you're standing and singing, unless you're crazy tall, it's going to capture those reflections pretty well as well. And so it's good, even coverage. Now, on an 8-foot wall, all you need to figure, so measure the wall. If you have an 8-foot wall, then you're just going to subtract 6.5 feet from that. That'll give you 1.5 feet. Then we need to measure our French cleats put together. So both sides of the French cleats, the side that's going to be on the wall and the side that's going to be on the panel, put them together and get that measurement, and then add a 1/2 inch and then measure and draw a line. So in my case, I'm doing something a little bit different because I'm under a soffit and I want to match this panel and the panel behind me. That panel, the black panel, is actually from the ground. So I had to figure out that height and then figure out how far it was from the ceiling. And then for me, just 4.5 inches plus these, which are about 3.5 inches. So I'm coming down just under 8 inches here to get to this line. So once you figure that out, use a level to draw a nice level line. And that's going to be around the points that you think you're going to have your French cleats on your panel. Once you have that level line, then you want to see if you can find a stud. If you're doing just one French cleat on your panel, then you need to center that on the panel, and you're probably not going to land in a stud perfectly to have it exactly where you want it in the room. And that's okay with 2 drywall anchors, which I will show you in a minute. But if you can get at least one into a stud, like I am going to on this panel, then you want to find that stud and go from there. So I'm doing 2 French cleats, so that gives me a little more flexibility. So to find your studs, there's a couple approaches. The first is the knocking approach. Basically, you just knock, and where it gets higher pitched, there's typically something behind the drywall there, and that in a lot of cases is a stud. So if it's more hollow, then usually not a stud, and as you hear it get higher pitched, usually sometimes a stud back there. Good, not necessarily the most reliable. The second approach is using a stud finder. Sadly, you think this would be super reliable. I found there'd be pretty hit or miss as well. But in this case, I'm just using this one from Craftsman, and you would just drag it from where you're pretty sure there's not a stud over to where there might be a stud. It'll beep at you, add a mark, and then come from the other direction, and then add a mark. And so in this case, it gave me like a 3.5 inch range. That's probably too much. So I would use the tapping method here to get a little bit more specific. I'm pretty sure somewhere kind of right in the center of that, there's a stud somewhere right around there. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take your French cleat and set it so that the bottom of it is at the bottom of your line, since you measured both. And then you're going to set it where you think one of these holes is going to hit a stud. We'll line that up on the line since we know that line is level. And then I'm going to do a circle where the holes are. We'll come back and we'll do a drill bit test to confirm that there's a stud there. And if not, I might have to flex left or right. But if you have to do a couple extra holes, it's going to be behind the panel, so that's fine. Okay, we're in a stud. You can tell when you hit a stud because it's much tougher than drilling through drywall. When you don't hit a stud, it just kind of bursts through once it gets through the drywall. My guess is I don't have a stud here, but let's test that. And I appear to have a stud in both, so that's great. So this French cleat's going to be super sturdy. The next one is pretty much definitely not going to be in a stud, so I'll show you drywall anchors on that one. Okay, now for the second French cleat, there's a few different ways you could do this, but the way that I'm going to do it here is I'm basically going to make the 2 French cleats centered around the center of the panel. So in this case, coming from this panel here, I'm about 1.25 inches off from the center to the start of this French cleat, so I want to go 1.25 inches off to the next French cleat. So for me, that's going to be, or sorry, 3/4. So that's going to be 17 3/4. I'm just going to line it up here and mark that. And that's going to be the edge of my second French cleat. So we'll go ahead and put our second French cleat on here, lined up with the line that we drew from the ceiling, and then there, mark that. And we are going to go ahead, double check that we're not into a stud. I'm pretty sure we're going to be in a drywall here. If I tap, it sounds pretty hollow, in which case we're going to do drywall anchors, and I'll show you that. So you can tell that we're not in a stud here because as I drill into this, you'll see my drill will just easily move into it. Yeah, definitely not a stud. So we want to up our drill bit size. We went from this where we were doing our little stud test finder and for our screws up to this. This is a 3/16, I believe. So if you get the same French cleats as the ones that I list, then this should work for you, but also just double check in case they change anything that the drill bit is smaller than the anchor. So you just want to make sure, hold up your anchor to the drill bit and just make sure that's a little bit smaller. It wants to be close in size, but a little bit smaller. We're going to drill 2 holes here where we've already marked them. And then we just want to put our anchor in and tap it in. Watch your fingers, be careful. We'll do that again with this other hole. Okay, so those should give a decent amount of stability. Now we're going to go ahead and screw our second French cleat in. And before you tighten the screws all the way, you can check your level here. There's not a whole lot of flexibility that you have with the drywall anchors, but it might just give you a little bit of, oh, if I can tilt it up just a tad, it's going to be a little more level. So we're going to go for that, see if we can get it just a little bit more level there as we tighten it all the way. And that's looking better for sure. Okay, and then you have your screws, and it's pretty sturdy. Okay, so the last thing we want to do is actually slide the French cleats that we're going to attach to our panel in. And we just want to double check our measurements here. So I'm going to pop these both in, and then I want to measure down from the ceiling and double check that that is where I want it to be, or at least what is the distance here. So for me, the distance is about 1/8 of an inch from where I want the top of my panel to be, actually about 1/16 of an inch. And on this side, it's a little bit more, but roughly the same. So you can use that if there's a difference there. If you have a 1/2 inch difference there, that's how far down you're going to come on your panel as you mount your French cleats. Okay, last step is to mount these to the actual panel. So we got to figure out the spacing here. Basically, in this case, what I know is it's going to be the center of the panel and then 1.75 inches off to the right and 1.75 inches off to the left. And the great thing about French cleats is if you're a little bit off, you have this amount of space to play with. Obviously, you don't want it hanging on by a thread, but you have a little bit of space where it can be off by a little bit and you can still have a really sturdy hold. Now, a quick note, if you get the exact same French cleats that I did, that I've listed down below, they send you super tiny little screws because they want you to basically use these on picture frames. Since we're doing something heavier, you'll want something longer. So luckily I had a longer screw. It's not quite as long as the other ones I sent. If I find a better one, then I will list it in the description that definitely has all full-length screws. But just use a slightly longer screw than these little tiny teensy ones. And let's go ahead and drill those on. And just to be clear, you're mounting these with the lifted edge down so that it can slide down into the French cleat that's already hung on the wall. So just a little tip I was reminded of as I went to try to hang this, that you also want to make sure that any fabric that's below the French cleat is stapled down really well. In this case, mine got caught on the fabric and it was preventing it from actually sliding onto the French cleat. So we're just going to pull this fabric down and do a few staples right at the bottom. Once you're all ready, just grab your panel, lift it up above the French cleats, slide it down, and there you go. You've got a mounted acoustic panel, hopefully a few. All right, I hope you enjoyed that build. If you did, or if you have any questions, definitely let me know down in the comments below. Pretty soon we're going to be talking about how I built this wall. This wall behind me is actually a huge acoustic panel, so definitely come back for that. And if you don't already have it, be sure to grab your Home Studio Pro checklist for free from the link in the description below. See you soon.
One thing at a time, I can only handle